Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SitRep. SitRep is an notorious open source intelligence app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SitRep, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias.
And I'm Christian, the CEO of Artorias.
And we are now doing a third segment of the follow-up diplomatic crisis, now it seems, between the United States and Russia, related to trying to find either a ceasefire or a peace treaty or a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. To our listeners who've watched our first two episodes related to this, the first episode we covered was prior to the summit in Alaska between President Trump and President Putin. Afterwards, we had another episode to kind of give our initial reactions to the culmination of both that meeting and the meeting on Monday between President Trump, President Zelensky, and our European and NATO allies in Washington, D.C. And the news that have broke today indicate that any flurry of diplomatic activity and possibility of possibly reaching any sort of agreement might be already dead prior to a bilateral summit between Zelensky and Putin. Today, we got reporting that President Putin continues his hardcore demands that Ukraine pulls out completely from the Donbas regions, meaning Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, and in exchange, he would freeze the front line in Zaporizhia and Kherson. In addition, Putin demanded that Ukraine not only does not have the possibility of joining NATO, and that no foreign troops can be based out of there, which was a clear disagreement that he reached with President Trump in the Alaska meeting, in which President Trump stated Putin agreed that the United States and Europe would provide security guarantees for Ukraine. And those security guarantees was explicitly stated as having boots on the ground in Ukraine. In our previous episode, we highlighted how this was going to be a major concern and issue with negotiation, as in there is no chance that Russia would allow foreign troops to be based in Ukraine. Lastly, one of President Putin's and follow-on Sergei Lavrov explained to this during a press conference in Moscow, indicated that as the security guarantors must include Russia as well. In other words, if Ukraine is attacked again by Russia, Russia would have the ability to veto any military support to Ukraine. Even the White House, unofficially and through channels and reporting, indicated that this demand that Russia becomes a security guarantor of Ukraine is laughable. And that was the quote cited. So, Christian, let me go to you. We're seeing a lot of flurry activity, but based on our previous episode, shortly after the summit and the negotiations really started happening, President Putin and Russia continues with their hard demands, but it now appears that Trump might be taking a harder stance against the Russians. What is your initial thoughts and reactions?
I mean, it plays exactly into the playbook that I've said in the last two episodes, and even prior, that my theory is Trump's going to try to rapid fire diplomacy. It's not going to work, and he's going to get super frustrated and in turn escalate this conflict out of control.
Well, I was expecting, I guess you want to not go into your Christian Montessori monologues that are very good and phenomenal, because you and I were discussing this a little bit in the background. President Trump today on Truth Social, one made this very interesting post indicating that one of the reasons why Ukraine might be failing is their inability to go on the offense, and really criticizing, I guess, the Biden administration for basically allowing Ukraine to defend itself, but not really do much more than that. Although Ukraine has developed a lot of capabilities to conduct deep strikes into Russia. We've even seen them launch offensive operations into Russian territory, sovereign territory, internationally recognized. But President Trump in his Truth Social post today really highlighted that problem sets. And then he uploaded an image kind of comparing himself to, Christian, what you alluded to in this previous episode, to kind of this Cold War mentality in which, you could see historical comparisons with Nixon's holding the Soviets accountable, pointing directly a finger, and an image above that, President Trump doing the same with President Putin. And so do you think, Christian, as something you alluded to in the previous episode, is this kind of Trump being raised during the Cold War, having lived the Cold War, having lived Ronald Reagan and this kind of very hard stance against the Soviet Union back then? Do you think President Trump might be taking a very similar playbook now because of his frustrations with President Putin's and Russia's very maximalist demands and not being able to negotiate good faith? Do you think he might be pulling a little bit from this Cold War mentality and upbringing to apply it now in this second term?
Yeah, I mean, his photo today, which is hilarious because from the Nixon era, is personally laughable to me because I think Trump thinks of himself as like the prodigy of Reagan. And as we all know here, like Reagan was pretty harsh on the Soviets, but he was also very like attempting to be diplomatic. And in all honesty, I think he did a decent job. Um, Obviously, depending on what administration was handling the Soviets, it handled it very differently. The normal relationship has always been sour between the West and Russia, obviously, even prior to World War II even occurring. For those that aren't looking back that far, like the United States and Russia have worked together in various things, but have always had very different views on each other. The U.S. has always been very hawkish of Russia. In turn, Russia became incredibly hawkish of the U.S. And even through the Bush and Obama administration more recently of trying to like formalize better ties with Russia, that hawkishness on the Russian side has definitely carried over. Um, I think Trump akinning himself to that era would be beneficial if Trump was capable of playing ball and being more harsh, but I don't, like I said on the last episode, I don't think he's capable of that. I don't think he's as like much of a strong man as he associates himself with being. And again, that puts us kind of in a dangerous spot because, as Matt will say here in a minute, the foreign policy and at least what everybody sees publicly is like just a giant schizophrenic mess. Like one day we're trying to be best friends with Putin, we're rolling out a red carpet from him. In the same stroke, we're flying a B-2 bomber and doing some very subtle nuclear blackmail, if you will, towards Putin. And other days we're like, yeah, like Zelensky's terrible. We're shouting at him in a press conference. And then the next day we're like, Russia's totally bad. Like this is coming harking back to the Cuban Missile Crisis-esque. Like I won't say the word nuclear, N-word level of like subtle aggression that Trump plays. So it's like it's kind of all over the place. It's as if he like threw the dinner at the wall and we're trying to figure out what he cooked. It's kind of just like it's just too messy to kind of figure out. But again, I think that aligns us more in a dangerous spot. I know I've said it on X, I've said it in countless other places. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of Biden's policies internally to the U.S., but the one thing he was is consistent in Ukraine. I don't think he was harsh enough. I think everybody in the analysis world will believe that, and the intel community will believe that. But at the end of the day, he was genuinely consistent on how his foreign policy regarding Russia would play out. Um, Trump, on the other hand, will change his mood pretty much from the last person he speaks to. I know I alluded to it in the last episode that I think people aren't giving Melania enough credit in the background. I think she is controlling this way more than we see. Whether that be the letter she wrote Putin or some of the soft policy that she's been doing regarding Ukraine directly, regarding the children that have been abducted by Russia. It's kind of all over the place. I'd like to see a world where Trump puts his foot down and actually acts like a man and goes toe to toe with Putin. I think we're kind of stepping towards that right now. Is he ready for it? I'm not exactly sure. And I don't believe that he would be the candidate I would choose to do that. I think Macron is probably better suited actually for this role. I know I'll probably get some flack from some French listeners on our side, but like he is very hawkish and he has been since day one. He's been able to play out and see this entire war from start to finish. I think he is one of the only leaders in that case that has been there since pre-war and through the war and has been able to watch it, and he hasn't changed his stance at all. But yeah, I'd love to hear your opinions on this as well, Matt.
I mean, I think it's very much what you said, and I think the term schizophrenic is the perfect way to explain what people are seeing in this policy, which is to say that you can't really explain this policy. It doesn't seem to truly be anchored in anything. I don't see a structure. I don't see consistent goals from what the United States would like to accomplish. I think one of the things that is really interesting about this is there was all this talk about this mineral deal. Um, but where are those minerals? Many of them, if not most, are in the Donbass. So ceding control or pressuring Zelensky to consider giving control of the Donbass beyond the implications that it would have on the front line and losing the fortified front line that Ukraine has worked to build is that that Ukraine would lose control over the minerals that the United States was looking to include in that deal. So I think that's just one example, but I think it's very telling in terms of the lack of sort of a strategic level vision from the administration. And when we see, my main concern going into Alaska was that Putin would outclass Trump, and that's what we saw. Um, it didn't seem like there was any true pushback. It seemed like the European leaders were very concerned with how that meeting went. And then on the other hand, in the time that has now passed since that conversation, which wasn't even a week ago at this point, we're starting to see the rhetoric tick up from Trump and the administration. The problem being, or at least the problem as I see it, is that rhetoric doesn't really have any weight behind it. So if there's not any sort of true deterrence that is tied to that rhetoric, then really, they're inching up the escalation ladder without making any real gains strategically. And again, you have to have an anchored view of diplomacy and key goals that you're looking to achieve to really build that. So I just right now there's a lot of talk. He's talking about going on the offensive, but he has been a much less reliable partner to Ukraine. There was a lot more that the Biden administration could have done. I think, as Christian said, we all think that they were moving up the escalation ladder too slowly. They were giving enough for Ukraine not to lose, but not enough for them to win. But Trump has also, his DOD came out saying that they were going to freeze these weapon shipments. A few weeks later, Trump says, nope, they're back on. Then we have Trump being very conciliatory towards Putin in the summit in Alaska, and now we're seeing this rhetoric on Truth Social. So I think the whole thing is very concerning, and I worry about knee-jerk reactions from the Trump administration.
And so, if I may, I think one of the issues, though, when we're analyzing this, I think we have to take into consideration kind of the differences of the Biden administration and kind of the Trump administration. I believe the Biden administration, pre-invasion, really did a lot of diplomatic activity to see if there could be an off-ramp, with the clear understanding that they were very, very sure that Russia was going to invade. And then once the invasion happened, I think the Biden administration said the only way that victory can be achieved is by kind of a military defeat with Russia, but taking very much I think too much into consideration kind of the escalation ladder and where this might go one way or another. But I think from the Biden administration, it was to cause a Russian military defeat as the only way to achieve a diplomatic solution to this crisis and to this war. Where I think the Trump administration and President Trump came into this was looking at this through his campaign promises of 2024, which was no new wars, and then this idea of trying to get peace around the world, right? I think this singular obsession with the Nobel Peace Prize that President Trump has, and I think that was the angle he was moving forward. And I think he basically used his political leverage and geopolitical leverage much more on Ukraine than in Russia, when he believed that President Zelensky wasn't amendable to the demands he wanted to set foot, not take into account kind of Ukrainians' laws and sensitivities and political nature, and the fact that they've also been fighting this war for 3 years. He brushed that aside, and that's, I think, what happened in February. And then when he got Zelensky, to a position where he felt comfortable, that's when he approached kind of, President Putin. And there's always been this sense of deference to President Putin and how he operates. And they give him much more leniency than anybody else. And there might be a belief internally within the Trump administration that one, either they don't have that much geopolitical leverage against the Russians, or two, we've kind of seen still some people, I think, demonstrated, they're not in the administration, but, Vivek Ramaswamy, the former, Russia Republican political presidential candidate, famously kind of articulated this foreign policy of trying to just, get Russia away from China's orbit, and somehow, this very much similar situation of rapprochement between Nixon and Mao Zedong, and directed against the Soviet Union. This same idea of trying to do the same with Russia against China. But at the same time, though, I think where we've seen a shift in the Trump administration from when they first came into office and now is there has been significant amount of deals that have been signed between the United States and Ukraine. That way, I think where Trump, a lot of this focus domestically is analyzing this as trying to say, look, I'm not giving aid. These are military economic deals beneficial to America. NATO and Ukraine will buy our products, and then they will be used to fight against the Russians. But it's no longer this aid perspective. It's more of deals and economic deals, which we know that President Trump is very much in that transactional nature of his administration. And we see this a lot in the Middle East. And I think, the European Union, NATO, specifically the NATO Secretary General, was very key in leveraging that in the context for Ukraine and doing it. And when we've seen halts post kind of the crisis in February, it does look like a lot of the halts of military shipments came from people underneath the Trump administration, outside of the purview of the White House and directly within the Secretary of Defense office, right? Colby being very much probably a lot to blame for a lot of the halting. But we have seen a lot of that continue. And I think now the situation, I'm wondering, is now Trump has rightfully, I think, identified Putin as being the main obstacle for peace. I'm very encouraged by the reporting that, and even in the press conference, we saw this when they didn't take questions in Alaska between President Putin and President Trump, in which President Trump did allude to very hard demands that can't be achieved. And I think those are two specific issues, which is one, Ukraine have to give up more territory just to achieve a ceasefire. And then two, the security guarantees. I'm even because President Trump said, look, we're not going to send boots on the ground. That has to be the European Union. But he has always left open the ability of U.S. Air Force assets. And there's even more and more conversations, at least from the White House, of incorporating American air power for any security guarantees. And I think I'm wondering, at least in the diplomatic sense, patience might be running out on President Putin. Again, this is short, and you guys have highlighted the back and forth and kind of the unstable aspect, almost into the sense of almost like bipolar diplomatic outreach to Russia. But the trend overall does show continuous loss of patience. I'm wondering if it does not look, it looks like President Putin is very adamant that of his demands, and they're not going to drop that. The things that I would be looking at first is the Senate bill for the sanctions list, right? That Senator Lindsey Graham was read up in the Senate and co-sponsored by over 80 senators. If that gets passed, it's pretty much done. But Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, alluded to this in the Sunday talk shows, morning talk shows, that their perspective is if this passes, any possibility of a diplomatic solution is done. I guess the question is, how much more can President Putin try to drag this out? Because I alluded to this in my previous episode. I think that's Putin's goals, is to try to say enough to ensure that the sanctions doesn't get through, but drag this long enough where he thinks that he can achieve something militarily and try to make a fait accompli after the fact. I think that's a very risky assumption by President Putin. At least the military component and the equipment is still flowing into Ukraine, very much so. And I think time will tell, because we constantly hear the 2 weeks, the 10 days, the 2 weeks, the 2 weeks. This is never ending 2 weeks. I think the weakest link of that is Steve Witkoff, because every time it looks like sanctions are going to get passed or something severe is going to happen, Steve Witkoff gets dispatched to Russia. The Russians, for all intents and purposes, play on Steve Witkoff, play him. And then they feed him either false information or information that Steve Witkoff is not interpreting correctly, and that's when we get these summits. I think if the Zelensky Putin summit doesn't happen, um, I do believe that the blame is going to be on Putin because President Trump has stated on multiple occasions, very vocally, that at least security guarantees for Ukraine must be provided, and that must be led by the United States, and that the demands that Russia should be a security guarantor of Ukraine. Right now, at least, the United States views that as a laughable proposition.
I would say I take a much more pessimistic view on this. If it took Trump this long to realize that Russia was not only the aggressor, but the major roadblock to achieving peace in this conflict, that doesn't speak very well to U.S. policy. Additionally, that's not how he treated Putin when they met in Alaska. So I guess, is this something that just happened over the course of the past few days? I think by allowing Putin to come to the United States uh, and hold this summit without Ukraine at the table, without the Europeans at the table, this legitimizes Putin, someone who is wanted by the International Criminal Court. This is not something that, someone eyeing the Nobel Peace Prize would do, in my opinion. So by not really pushing back strongly on the demands by Moscow, and because of this rhetoric that seems to come from both directions, it's sending mixed signals. To me, the biggest problem with sending mixed signals is that it means that the red lines for this administration and for this administration's policy are not clear. And that incentivizes Russia to continue to push and to test those boundaries. And we're legitimizing through some of this conversation with Trump discussing land swaps and entertaining the idea of Ukraine having to give up the Donbass. It's also legitimizing this sort of revisionist and expansionist tactic that we're seeing from Russia. It really undermines unity with our allies and our partners and undermines the world order as it's been established. So I don't think that just because Trump is saying something that anyone is taking it all that seriously. And that's a problem. So floating these guarantees is one thing, but if he's not willing to truly back them, or if our allies and Ukraine doesn't think that we're actually going to back them, then they're essentially without teeth. And that is a problem because that's then not a security guarantee. And no one can blame Ukraine for being skeptical when there's been this back and forth when it comes to policy and rhetoric. And I do worry when we see the Europeans that we're potentially undermining unity between our closest partners. We're having these conversations with Putin. They kind of feel like they're having to take a back seat. They're trying to support Ukraine the best they can, but if they don't know what the end state is or which direction the US is facing, it makes it very difficult for that coordination. So I see so many issues with the way they are handling this. And I don't think that we've ever seen with Trump anything truly of substance. I think for Trump, it's about putting things into his narrative. It's about, how it plays. What are the little sound bites that the media can use? But it's not about anything of substance. And that makes me worried. And I think it makes the United States look weak if this rhetoric continues without any sort of backing.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in here as well. Um, the, I don't believe the Putin-Trump summit in Alaska got anything done. It's really hard to converse 3 years of war plus how to stop that war in the 2 hours and 15 minutes it took for them to conversate between both delegations. So I'm not convinced anything came out of that. And I believe that the reason why they didn't take any press questions was more or less, let's try to stay out of the media's limelight as much as we can to save both of our faces, because both of us are going to walk out of this and go to our constituents and look like idiots. Because I don't think anything got done. Nothing that was talked about between them to the press after the fact. I know there was that Fox News interview that happened right after that looked like it was pre-recorded even before the summit even happened, where Trump basically came out with all of these basically like statements that concessions are going to be made on both sides, et cetera, et cetera. Monday comes around, Trump meets with Zelensky, meets with all the European heads and all the security heads. Nothing really comes of that either, besides the fact that Ukraine's not going to concede land that they control, et cetera, et cetera. And then now today, it just comes down to the boil of, all right, we're not any more forward than we were 3 weeks ago. If anything, we're now even more behind than we were when it comes to negotiating because all of these other faucets are pouring into this. And none of it really seems to make any sort of rational, logical sense in terms of getting a conclusion on the table. So I'm not really convinced, like I said, the Putin-Trump summit had anything to do with the negotiations. I think it was really just a vanity stunt, as you said, Matt. It's kind of just like, if that's the case, though, and we're moving past that, and now not even less than less than a week later, literally a day before a week, 6 days after the fact they met, now we're having discussions of Trump completely 180ing, supporting Russia in this stance at all, and is now fully on the tail of, all right, we're going to give it 2 weeks, and if that 2 weeks happens, we're going to just increase every possible arms scenario. I think it's good to highlight. I don't think we even highlighted on it that Trump openly on social media today said that he disagreed with how Joe Biden, and I'm paraphrasing, he didn't say it verbatim like this, but he basically said that he disagrees with how Biden did things. And to win and have negotiating power, you need to pound the other guy into the sand. It's the same thing I said the first episode when we were predicting what would happen. I still, to this day, believe that Trump is going to go down the path of escalation. I think he's just shit scared and he's trying to save face. But I also, at the end of the day, do believe that he genuinely wants peace. I believe that. I believe the Ukrainians genuinely want peace. And the only actor in this entire equation that doesn't seem to care about the peace aspect is Putin. And where does that lead? Again, I don't see Putin's itinerary changing. I think he's going to continue to tread course as he has been, even prior to this war. This isn't the only time that something like this has happened. I mean, Georgia is still contested. We have a bunch of other things going on in the world of Russia that have nothing to do with Ukraine that Putin has doubled, tripled, quadrupled down on over the last 3 decades. And again, we find ourselves in an exact same scenario just as that.
So, a little bit, I think one of the interesting aspects that we're seeing outside of even just the sanctions, I mean, Ukraine has, they announced and kind of shown their pretty much funnily named the Flamingo cruise missile, which has a range, I believe the last one they claimed, 3,500 kilometers, if memory serves me correctly. And we've seen a significant increase on drone strikes in Russia, but specifically targeting Russian oil and gas facilities, probably much more so than in the past. To the point that we're actually running into situations inside of Russia where certain areas they're having gas disruptions. We've even seen protests in Donetsk specifically about this, and then in Russia proper. And so I'm wondering if this might be an opportunity where President Trump, and the administration kind of down the ranks is kind of enabling a lot of the Ukrainians to do this a lot more so to kind of force Russia's hand. Because I'm wondering, I think, from the administration perspective, and I think this is kind of a bipartisan, right? I think this was both kind of concurrent between the Biden and the Trump administration. The belief that, okay, to a military success, the ability to defeat Russia militarily was pretty much gone once President Putin decided to launch his first mobilization way back shortly after the war started. Because at that point, kind of the Russians' conventional military force was defeated. And I think I think in the Biden administration, there was a hope and desire that the defeat of the Russian conventional military would enable for serious negotiations to actually happen. But when Putin decided to do a mass mobilization, there is an understanding, okay, that's out of the window, and that clearly the Russians are willing to commit much more military force and suffer much more military casualties to achieve their goal. And we haven't really seen a break within Russian society because of the casualties, right? Because I think we can all remember, history taught us that during the Soviet Afghanistan war, the death of, just 10,000, over 10,000 Russian soldiers was a huge political problem for Gorbachev. But the death of hundreds of thousands of Russian military soldiers um, did not really cause a dent in Russia's public opinion. And so there's probably this idea of the economic front where the Russians, I think, have managed to really barricade themselves, and they're trying to withstand this significantly longer, and a lot of that. And I think, the sovereign wealth fund is a perfect example where, look, Russia militarily probably has more time. Economically, they have less time, but they still have time to really press as much as they can in Ukraine. And I'm wondering if a lot of these strike campaigns is designed to cause much more political problems inside of Russia to force their hand in the negotiation table, so at least reduce the demand. I don't know if it's going to be necessarily a successful strategy, but that's an interesting aspect and dynamic that I've seen kind of shifted, specifically in the Ukrainians, when we know they've targeted Russian oil facilities, et cetera. But this time, unlike in the past where there was certain disruptions, this does appear to cause much more problems now for the Russians than in other areas. But Matt, go ahead.
So that might be the case, and I think eventually this is going to pose a problem. The thing is, it's kind of like sanctions; they don't work until they do. So we can't really pinpoint when that tipping point is going to be. But I do think domestically, somewhere along on the horizon, there is a problem for Putin, but pinpointing that is very difficult. What kind of concerns me is the the lack of willingness to utilize our own leverage. So I understand giving Ukraine the tools or the go-ahead to increase their leverage, but the United States, Trump was talking about increasing pressure on China and India for buying Russian oil, but that's not necessarily something that we've seen. So we have these means where we could be supplying more weapons to Ukraine, but we're right now just seeing the rhetoric. We need action, and I worry that we're ceding some of the potential to increase leverage from the United States. And when it comes to sort of stepping back from the diplomacy, as Trump has indicated, the United States might do, this is really ceding the framework of those discussions over to Russia. And they're going to be able to dictate sort of their own battle pace in the run up for this. We're giving them more of a runway, and Ukraine is coming to the table at a military disadvantage. And it seems like with less backing from the United States, unless we see actual solid actions from the United States that look to be providing more support behind Ukraine's stance. And that's where, I understand there's this talk behind the security guarantees. I'm not sure I see those going anywhere. If a red line in these discussions for Putin is NATO membership for Ukraine, well, what's the reason for that? It's because that would give them the protection of Article 5. So how can we have any sort of meaningful security guarantees that Russia might accept if they are, so afraid of something like Article 5? So until we see a framework put in place, I'm still very pessimistic and skeptical that anything that the United States is doing is making a diplomatic solution more likely.
And I think that's the issue, right? I mean, I think because President Zelensky has stated that he's willing to freeze the front line, um, and and enter into a ceasefire. And I think that kind of the specific explanation is saying Ukraine will acknowledge de facto Russia control of Ukrainian occupied territory, but de jure they never will. And that's kind of, the acceptance of what's kind of going on. Um, but in exchange for security guarantees, but President Putin continues to demand more territory, because I think the problem that the Russians are running into is that I think their military objectives to seize Donetsk and Luhansk in their entirety will require significantly more military forces and and military operations than they're currently willing to do. And it would take a very, very long time for that to achieve it. I think the Russians have this almost false belief that the Ukrainian military is on the verge of collapse. And even if they were, that somehow the Russian military would be able to quickly exploit the situation, which we've seen Russia absolutely unable to accomplish. And so that's where I think the Russians are trying to leverage the diplomatic front to achieve their objectives that they can't do militarily. But, again, it goes back to that. I think the diplomatic route is dead because, Finland Prime Minister Stubb, very famously said, Russia doesn't get to dictate Ukrainian security guarantees, right? That's part of the peace treaty. And obviously that would be unacceptable because if, from Putin's perspective, right, if he launched this whole war and let's say they managed to occupy more Ukrainian territory, well, it defeats the purpose, as you alluded to, Matt. One, the Article 5 like security guarantees that although outside of NATO, it would be NATO countries enforcing it. And number two, the presence of Western troops inside of Russia, which the Russians have said they will never accept. And so that's this is the aspect of the security guarantees during the Anchorage summit where, I think Putin said, oh, yeah, Ukraine can have security guarantees. And he just didn't highlight the caveats because they made it very clear they will not accept the presence of Western troops in Ukraine. But the only way Ukraine will rightfully accept any security guarantees is Western troops. Because from the Ukrainian perspective, they were invaded in 2014. They seized Crimea, then they invaded the Donbass, they invaded the Donetsk. That lasted for years until February 22, where they invaded again. And the only way they can make sure that doesn't happen again is with the presence of Western troops. But the Russians, if that ever happens, the whole purpose of this invasion would be for naught because they basically have what years ago was unimaginable, which was the presence of Western troops inside of Ukraine. And I think that's why the diplomatic front is completely done. I just do not see any, this is the position that is unacceptable for Putin. And I think where the Trump administration is analyzing this is I've managed to convince Ukraine to at least de facto recognize Russia occupied territory inside of Ukraine, which was a huge, again, this is analyzing from Trump's perspective, a huge accomplishment. And then and you can criticize it or endorse it however you feel fit. And that's a valid criticism to say, why should we force Ukraine to accept it even de facto? But from Trump's perspective, and specifically from his political leanings and to his base, he can claim, I got Ukraine to accept it as de facto on the conditions of security guarantees. If I do not provide security guarantees to Ukraine, then I think this goes back to the image where Trump is even more concerned, which is of weakness. Is this aspect of weakness that he had to fold to Russia's demand and Russia gave up nothing. And I think and if we're trying to analyze this from Trump's negotiations and kind of the art of the deal and all that, that's so key to him, the security guarantees and I think falls within that realm as the minimum acceptance level for Ukraine to at least de facto recognize everything. And if that were to fold, I think people would view Trump as a weak negotiator who just folds in the hands of the Russians. And I'm encouraged by the stance that the Trump administration is doing. And I think it's also very important to highlight he can also leverage the Europeans' positions on this because the Europeans are clearly showing, at least a lot of the leadership in Europe, to be much more hawkish. And I think there's an alignment between Europe and the US on this, on the security guarantees. And Trump can always go back to not only the Ukrainian demands, but the Europeans and say, look, this is part of a multinational diplomatic push, not just US and Russia, because although the Anchorage summit was between Trump and Putin only, Trump did carry a lot of the negotiations and tactics and positions of Ukraine and more broadly Europe. And he was speaking not only from a position of the Ukrainians, but the Europeans as a whole. And I think the follow-on summit that they were trying to get between Putin and Zelensky, which we still don't necessarily know where it's going to happen, It looks like maybe now Hungary is a possibility. The idea, though, that then Monday everybody came into Washington, D.C., I think that security aspect and security guarantees, if Trump doesn't get that through in a peace treaty, he would be viewed as having folded again to the Russians and as being a weak negotiator and really undermining this idea of peace through strength, which I think if people wanted to remember during the transition, that was a huge narrative that was being pushed within the incoming administration back then. Peace through strength. And the security guarantees, I think Trump has shown that he is absolutely committed to that because he managed to get the Ukrainians to de facto recognize Ukrainian, Russian occupied territories. Christian, go ahead.
Oh, I love when people say peace through strength, and it's in relation to Trump because I haven't seen any strength whatsoever. I really haven't. I haven't seen any tangible truth to that statement. I know that there's been some increased ISR sharing, but outside of that, I haven't seen shit, and I still don't see anything. And when I really talk about peace through strength, I'm more focused on, all right, peace through strength. Are you going to start the sanctions? Like, when is that going to start? Because that ball was threatened over a month ago now, and now we're still waiting for that to be put into place. I'm still waiting to see the entire narrative that Trump's been playing of we're going to get to the negotiating table, they're going to listen to me. Like, I'm not seeing any of that. And at the end of the day, like I've said previously, I don't think the sanctions hurt Russia that bad. I think Russia still has a lot in them in terms of becoming a wartime economy and so forth. Like, they can still do a lot. I still think that they have manpower that they can pull on. I still think they have resources. I mean, this is a country that literally all they did was build arms and munitions from the 1930s onwards. Like, I think they have a tremendous backlog of capabilities. I think they still have personnel that they can call on. I know that goes against a lot of what you guys have said previously, but that's just my belief. I mean, I've been following this conflict closely since 2014. So, like, I've done countless research papers on this stuff. Like, I've helped clients with this stuff. At the end of the day, I still think Russia has a lot in them. I think that that's why they're so quick to like play the card of like, yeah, let's negotiate a little bit just for the vanity of it. And if it falls apart, it falls apart because we're really not going to accept anything. But at the end of the day, like, I don't think Trump's not being the strong man he thinks he is. He can talk a big game, but like, at the end of the day, if you're rolling out a red carpet for the person that you're an adversary of, how the fuck does that look? You know what I mean? That's like me being in an altercation with somebody, and then they pat my back on my way to sit down and speak to them. It's like it's a kangaroo court at its best terms. You know, like, Putin knows exactly what they want. Trump's not going to give anything to Zelensky in terms of power. We're going to wait for the Russians to make a decision. I'm going to continue to threaten things, but nothing's really going to happen. And again, that's my fear, and that's kind of the basis that I have with that of it's going to escalate at a certain point because Trump's going to get so frustrated with it. But at the end of the day, Trump is creating that environment for himself. Again, I'm not a Biden supporter when it comes to like general foreign policy, but I do believe that he was right in the sense that he would have never even entertained having a conversation with Putin without Zelensky there. Zelensky's the one getting invaded. Ukraine's getting invaded. Russia's not getting invaded. Now they are. We'll talk about that in another episode. But at the end of the day, like, the hawkish, like, strongman mentality that Trump portrays to his constituents is not who he is as a person. He sucks at it. He's continuing to suck at it. We're not seeing any tangible results on the battlefield from the help of the United States. If that changes all of a sudden, that's when we all should get worried. And that's what I've been pushing this entire time. But yeah, I mean, I just hate this idea that he's just like this knight in shining armor is coming to the aid because I'm not seeing anything tangible coming from anything that he says.
Yeah, I think that kind of highlights my take on the rhetoric without teeth. But I will say, um, Stefano, in terms of what you were talking about, I think you're right in that a lot of this is perception, and he doesn't want to come across as weak, and he wants to, lean back and get some accomplishments in terms of what he had promised his base. But one of the big problems with that, as I see it, is he wants to look strong, but he's also promised his base, no more wars. And so he gets caught in sort of a catch-22 where it's very difficult for him to provide real backing to something like a security guarantee because his base would never stand for the United States and, either boots on the ground or establishing a position that might put the make the United States vulnerable to getting involved in some sort of escalation if it were to come to that. But the other point is that I would push back on slightly is um, my take on the Europeans coming to Washington, D.C. and um, the way Trump was presenting European concerns or Ukrainian concerns in the Alaska summit is really that he wasn't presenting it through a lens that they felt was acceptable. I think this was a all hands on deck type moment where they're getting readouts from that conversation and they're not happy with what they're seeing. They don't think that Trump is capturing their best interests or their positions on this matter. And that is why we saw them scramble to come and, stand side by side with Zelensky. We basically had, a NATO meeting in the White House. That's not something that you see very often. So I just think there's going to be this hesitancy, and the rhetoric is easy. Backing it up and developing a plan is going to be much more difficult. And I think we need to see at least a start of some sort of coherent strategy of putting more pressure on China, more pressure on India, and starting to build up some of these deterrences that we can use for leverage. Walking away from diplomacy altogether is not that. And I also think it's worth having a discussion about how we can plan ahead and establish something that is going to be more concrete in terms of a framework, whether or not Russia is going to be involved in this, because clear aims are going to be very important at the end of the day. And right now, I'm not seeing that.
So let me ask this question to you both. Let me go to you first, Christian, and then I'll go to Matthew. So, Christian, number one, where does this leave the bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky? Do you think it's going to happen? And if it does, what's your predictions? And if it doesn't, what do you think is the outcome or the consequences that might occur? And then, Matthew, the same question to you, but go ahead, Christian.
I'm going to be completely honest. I honestly think with Zelensky would take that meeting if it was offered in an actual neutral place, just for the sake to say that he did it and that he attempted for peace. I don't see it going over well in for a large number of reasons. To keep it very short and concise, which, as you guys know that listen, doesn't usually happen. But to keep it short and concise, I believe that would be an absolute shit show. Like, if you're gonna walk into a room with so let's just put it this way. If you're coming from Zelensky's perspective and you're walking into a room with Putin, the guy that's currently bombing all of your civilian infrastructure, abducting your children, genociding people, have been since first months of the war, and you're sitting there with the person that's executing all of that, as you just got done doing all of these bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral meetings with various different leaders from around the world in order to get peace. And every single time you do one of those meetings, there's more drone strikes, more ballistic missile strikes, more cruise missile strikes against your territory. I don't think you can really go into that meeting with like a lot of intent that something's going to get done. I would go into that meeting very furious, very upset, very cold, especially in a setting where the ceasefire hasn't been agreed on. Any thought of a ceasefire has always been squashed and tarnished. I mean, we can look back at like every time there's a Christmas ceasefire proposed. It's always breached within 20 minutes by Russia. Every single time, Putin's like, yeah, we're not going to fire on this day. Everybody fires on that day. Every time there's a peace meeting, there's firing during that day. When Trump and Putin were meeting, there was ballistic and drone strike incursions into Ukraine. When Zelensky was meeting with the European leaders and Trump on Monday, Again, there was drones and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles and incursions into Ukraine. So going into that meeting, don't think anything positively is going to happen. I don't know who would orchestrate that. I don't know what the security apparatus would look behind that. Because again, if I was either one of these sides, it's become such a personal conflict that that's my time to take out my opponent. Like who's going to actually host that in a way where the security can be guaranteed for both parties? It's a little different when Putin travels to the United States, especially Anchorage. The US will give Secret Service to the diplomats coming in, as well as Putin, of course. They'll be able to bring their own security. It's a massive ordeal. You're going to try to do that same thing with Zelensky and Putin in the same place, especially for a neutral place like Switzerland, for example, or Hungary, or another one of these countries, Turkey, for context. Like, these are still places that are going to need giant security apparatuses to be able to support a summit like this, a summit that's going to be tense between both parties, anyways. I mean, you got to think that people that are protecting Zelensky right now are a mixture of U.S. contractors and people that fought in the front lines of Ukraine that have seen their brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers die. You think they're not going to sit there peacefully next to Ukraine? Obviously, it's their job, but at the end of the day, like you got to think Putin's right there, and the same could be said in the other regard. I mean, the early days of the war, the VDV was tasked with overthrowing that government. They were tasked with finding Zelensky and killing him. That was their job. So like that's the thought process going into that meeting. I'm gonna go meet with the guy that just 3 years ago had a contract killing on my head and is now raping and pillaging my people. So even like before you even talk about the fundamentals of the conversation and what could possibly happen from that, you have to think about that being the foreground for that conversation. And again, every single time that something is moved, the needle's moved into a way where Russia has to make a concession, it's always moved back to the same talking points that started this war to begin with, of Ukraine is going to give up the Donbass, but they're going to give up more than the Donbass, and that's what's going to happen for peace to be achieved. And that is the concession Russia's making, a country that does not currently hold most of that land, in a country that wanted all of Ukraine just 3 years ago. So to me, it's not so much a conversation of what will happen from it, but more of a conversation of what there is risk to occur for a summit of that nature to occur, especially when going into this, both parties are completely so far differentiated on their opinions and points that even if they had perfectly clear minds, perfectly best friends, it's still a tough and long conversation that needs to be had. And if Trump can't do it in Anchorage, where the security and friendliness is at its utmost importance and is happening at a diplomatic level, I don't see it happening between the two leaders that are actively fighting. I just don't see it.
So, Matt, before you go in, let me just quickly jump in here with just a quick comment. President Putin, remember, months ago said, "Oh, we're going to meet with the Ukrainians. I'm willing to meet with the Ukrainians." And Zelensky in Istanbul, and Zelensky basically said, "Bet, I'll be there, Putin. I'll meet you there directly." And Putin was like, "No, no, no. That's not who we meant." And then they sent a very low-level delegation over where they can just continue the same talking points that they always did. I don't think Putin's going to meet Zelensky. I think Zelensky would be able to do it. I think, to your point, he has shown specifically, I think, by looking at the U.S., his willingness to negotiate. I think the reason why Putin doesn't want to meet with Zelensky because that he would, just as the reason why Putin got off with a win in Anchorage by showing that Russia isn't isolated, that's showing that Russia, meeting with President Trump directly in Anchorage as a sign of, Russia's position around the globe and strength and power. That's why Putin went there, because he knew the image of that and the status that would give to Russia himself, that they're not isolated. The reason why I don't think Putin in any scenario would meet with Zelensky directly is because he would legitimize, in his view, the Ukrainian president. And I think the argument against Ukraine has always been not only that the government is illegitimate, but just the concept of Ukraine as a nation state is illegitimate. But that starts with the political leadership before you can undermine the nation state as a whole. And I think that is always going to be a huge issue for Putin, that I think he just has this, regardless of just his deep-seated hatred for Zelensky specifically, just the idea of the image of giving the legitimacy to Zelensky is something that he will undermine. And I just don't see that as plausible. Go ahead, Matthew.
I mean that's exactly what I was going to say. Like that is exactly how I analyze this situation. I think Putin is more than happy to sort of drag this out and play this game and make it seem like this is a possibility because it buys time. It allows him to increase battle tempo, try and gain more ground and improve his positioning at the table. However, whoever ends up sitting around that table. Um, but at the end of the day, I don't think there's anyone should take him seriously if he comes out and says that he's interested in having this conversation for exactly the reasons that you outlined. He doesn't see Ukraine as sovereign. He's shown that by invading Ukraine and by stating that they want to take over the whole thing, reestablish, this dream of the Soviet Union. And he doesn't want to do the exact thing that Trump did for him, which is legitimize him, just like you were saying. So if he's not willing to drop these maximalist demands for the United States, I think there's absolutely zero chance that he would do so for Ukraine. And if Ukraine is coming to the table without, the full backing from the United States, they're in an even weaker position, and they're already coming to the table at a military disadvantage. So I tend to agree. I think we'll have to see what develops, what comes from this rhetoric. But I think for now we've pretty much covered the facets that we can, because now we're gonna have to continue to watch this, which of course we will, and see how this plays out in the coming days, weeks, and months. Any final thoughts, Stefano or Christian?
I would just say I think the idea that the Russians, I think there's a very serious miscalculations by the Russians and their military strength and their ability to continue this indefinite or at least for years. I would be very cautious as if President Putin, if I was advising him, you cannot assume that because Wagner is a perfect story. But Christian, it's funny. We thought that our previous episode was kind of ran about this, but obviously this breaking news really forced us to kind of do another episode. And I feel like we will definitely have much more episodes that are going to cover this topic. Right now, the diplomatic front is on very, very thin ice. And in any moment, it can snap and completely collapse. And we'll just go back to the killing that we see. And the question that we all have then is, how does President Trump respond to that? And so we'll all keep an eye on this. I want to thank Christian and Matthew so much for joining us for this episode, and to all our listeners. This has been the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast, and we'll see you soon.